Old Fish, the Decay of the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev's Reforms. You might want to pause this lecture for a minute and take a look at this photograph and think about the words you would use to describe this collection of people who happen to be the members of the Communist Party in 1981. Well, by 1981, the Brezhnev years are firmly in place, and it is the Cold War. The Cold War has been around for a while, so it's become an old war, and it is a bipolar world with two superpowers, seemingly so, a world divided between communist countries and NATO members and U.S. allies, and then there were other countries that appeared to be neutral, other countries who received a great deal of military aid from both the Soviet Union and the United States, but it was a very politicized world based on that country's relationship with the Soviet Union and the United States. And there is this Iron Curtain, so-called, that divides the superpowers, the Soviet Union's Eastern Bloc, and that Eastern Bloc hits right up against what we would call Western Europe, and you can see where this world divided leads to a nation divided with Germany, and even a city divided with Berlin. Let's take a moment and look at the balance sheet of the Brezhnev years during this Cold War. And on one hand, you could consider it a success. Nuclear parity was achieved. The space program excels. The rival, the foe of the Soviet Union has been humiliated. The United States was humiliated in Vietnam, while the Soviet Union extended influence throughout the Third World. And by 1965, the national income was 58% higher than in 1958. So it looked pretty good. Industrial production, steel production, oil production, all had made great gains, particularly in oil. And overall, the economic picture looked good. It was marked by this sort of Brezhnevian stability, this consensus, but it was overextended and decaying in part because of this Cold War and trying to keep up with its great superpower rival. And I think one historian summed it up very well when he said they won the wrong race. And what would that mean? But they won the wrong race. And in part it's because the Soviet Union, like the United States, was so focused on winning the arms race, the military aspect of the Cold War. And these are economic choices that are made by the government, and this was a centralized government economy, command economy in the Soviet Union. And you can see from this graph leading up until 1970 that the United States and the Soviet Union were attempting to outdo each other, and the rest of the world kind of stood back and watched. Consumers were neglected in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet consumers that can't buy goods because the shelves are empty, they see what the Western European world can offer through smuggled in glossy magazines or through radio shows that they are able to get a hold of. There is a great technology lag also, although the Soviet Union might excel in building and being able to staff a nuclear submarine force. Computers were something that appeared to threaten the Soviet administration, and sort of feared unleashing this amount of sort of information and control that is possible through this new technology, because the government wanted to be able to control technology, control information. And so I want to pause this line and look at the huge discrepancy between the Soviet Union's number of computers compared to the United States. And also, it's not only the number of computers, but also the generation or the quality of computers. And the United States and its allies far outpace what the Soviet Union has in in terms of computers. Also, the same was true in terms of things like copying machines, because copying machines meant you could create and distribute information. Late Soviet politics was marked by stagnation, government stagnation, and the population was by and large willing to stagnate along with it. There was seemingly no desire to reform by the Brezhnevian allies because it would make it uncomfortable for them, and they had a quite comfortable lifestyle. So they wanted to maintain the status quo, and the Brezhnev phrase that was used for this was "trust in the cadres," which means just trust us. We got this. There was just an overall refusal to institute any kind of institutional reform, because that would go against the very idea of this sort of stagnation that seemed to be working for at least the Brezhnev elites. And the Brezhnev administration could claim that they were neck and neck with their enemy, the United States, and so they had things that they could argue made them an important choice for the Soviet population. It has created sort of pride in Soviet achievements. But the economy was not good. There could be that pride of being a great power, that pride of being a space power, pride of being a submarine power, but consumer goods were lacking, and this led to the rise of the second economy, or the black market, that accounted for up to a quarter of the economic activity during these years. The Soviet citizen lacked the kind of buying power that the United States worker would have. And so the Soviet citizens, the Soviet workers, just had to work harder to get less. That would often cost more and was of poor quality. And inflation loomed. It appeared to be a serious threat, and inflation always sort of hurts the middle class the worst. And so increasingly there were sources of pessimism, in part because the consumers could begin to feel this of lack of goods, this lack of being valued in part by the government, and there was rising expectations, and rising expectations is a very dangerous time because people always think they should get more. There are Soviet citizens going on holiday to Eastern Europe and seeing what Eastern European countries have, and why don't they have it? I think this is a good snapshot of the Soviet Union as a modern urban society by 1970, and I would urge you to just pause the lecture right now and just kind of look at all the figures, but I just wanted to look at the two highlighted figures of what has happened. Is that in 1913 the peasantry was the overwhelming population of Russia, and then by 1970 instead it's the urban workers. So throughout this period, whether due to the Soviet policies or in spite of them, the Soviet Union became a modern urban society. But the communist system had stagnated and failed to keep up with this modernization. And as Martin Walker, I think, sums it up, he says, the country went through social revolution while Brezhnev slept. And in part, urbanization is the key to this, of what happens in the late Soviet years. You have old men, as we saw from the initial photograph used for this lecture, old men in a decaying system, unwilling to consider reforms because of the threat to instability, the threat to stability by unleashing any kind of reforms. So political stagnation was marked by this lack of innovation, and clearly the computers, the photocopying machines are clear evidence of this. And there's a great deal of corruption and privilege, abuse of privilege through this cronyism. And the Politburo was just old, composed of old men. By 1981, the average age of these men was in the lower 70s, and they were out of touch with the times. And so the Soviet Union was a great power, was one of the great two superpowers, but it lacked a great leader. Brezhnev by 1982, he looked very sick. And then he finally died, and followed by more sick old men that look like they're ready to die, and they die too, Andropov and Chernenko. And Andropov and Chernenko, they take over when Brezhnev dies after this very long reign, and they don't engage in the kind of mini reforms that were necessary. And time is ticking, and this is time being wasted. Andropov was a very fascinating sort of John le Carre figure. He survived as a KGB head for 15 years. This was quite an accomplishment. He was the head of the KGB far longer than he was the general secretary, which was from November 12th, 1982 to February 9th, 1984. He's very sick, and he did try to engage in some reforms, but they were very unpopular reforms, such as labor discipline. Many Soviet workers just left early to stand in lines to try and buy consumer goods that were in great shortage. Oftentimes, workers just weren't working; they were gone doing something else. And also, he clamped down on dissidents. And at this point, there begins a sort of a tick up on immigration movements, particularly the Jewish population. Chernenko follows, and he also is general secretary for a very brief time, 13 months. And he was just completely unqualified for this position. He was completely mediocre. And yet, here he is, wasting this valuable time when something really needs to be done. And Andropov had wanted Gorbachev as successor, but the allies of Chernenko placed him in. And this is seen as these 13 months, 1 year, could have made a difference in reform. Add to this the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which was just a bloody mess. And this is ongoing from December 25th, 1979 to February 1989. So this looms throughout this period. And this tries to tell a very complicated story in one brief slide. But 1978, the communists overthrow an aging dictator, and this communist dictator then invites the Soviet Union, is how they like to put it, to aid them. And this communism was seen as a violation of a very traditional, deeply rooted conservative society. And these tribal Muslim societies resist these efforts, and it leads to this war. And it's ultimately the United States gets involved on the other side because it's the Cold War, and so the United States is providing Stinger missiles to the so-called freedom fighters. And it becomes really an unwinnable and unpopular mess. And so by 1988, Gorbachev announces there will be a withdrawal, which is accomplished by early 1989. We will get back to the role of the Afghanistan war, in part because the mothers of these sons that are dying in this meaningless war, they are being lied to, and they're tired of being lied to. They're tired of having their sons die in a meaningless war. And the mothers really sort of kick off the first sort of large civil rights movement, or so civil society, at this time, before the Gorbachev years. And you might want to also consider how the Afghanistan war figures into a much larger context of the Middle East and the Middle East concerns of both superpowers. Now, the United States by this time is also aging and decaying in its leadership, and the USA responds that this evil empire must be stopped, and so they boycott the Moscow 1980 Olympics to show that they will not have any dealings with the evil empire. And Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, presents this Cold War as a very stark good and evil scenario. And the United States is the good side, the Soviet Union is the bad side. to complicate the matter.